There is a subtle danger that exists in almost every toxic pattern, and that danger is self-deception. Most people imagine toxic behaviors as something obvious, something easy to identify, something that stands out clearly against what is healthy and right. Yet the reality is often very different. The most destructive patterns are frequently the ones we become comfortable with. They settle into our routines, shape our decisions, and influence our relationships without us fully recognizing their presence. Over time, what should feel alarming begins to feel normal. What should be questioned becomes accepted. What should be confronted becomes defended. This is how self-deception keeps toxic cycles alive. The human mind has an incredible ability to justify almost anything when it wants to avoid discomfort. We tell ourselves stories that protect our pride, preserve our image, and shield us from painful truths. We convince ourselves that our reactions are reasonable, our attitudes are justified, and our choices are necessary. Even when evidence suggests otherwise, we continue believing these narratives because they feel safer than admitting that something within us needs to change. The problem is that every excuse we make for an unhealthy pattern gives it permission to remain. A person who constantly reacts with anger may tell themselves they are simply passionate. Someone who refuses to trust others may insist they are being cautious. A person who manipulates situations may claim they are only protecting themselves. Someone who avoids responsibility may believe they are a victim of unfair circumstances. While these explanations may contain elements of truth, they often become barriers that prevent deeper self-examination. Instead of asking whether their behavior is healthy, they focus on defending why it exists. This is where toxic cycles gain their strength. A pattern that is acknowledged can be challenged. A pattern that is denied becomes deeply rooted. The moment a person stops questioning their behavior, growth begins to slow. The moment they stop evaluating their motives, change becomes unlikely. Self-deception creates a false sense of security that allows dysfunction to continue unchecked. One of the reasons self-deception is so powerful is because it rarely feels dishonest. Most people are not intentionally lying to themselves. They genuinely believe their explanations. They genuinely think their actions are justified. That is why these patterns can persist for years. The mind naturally seeks consistency, and once a person forms a certain belief about themselves, they begin filtering experiences through that belief. Information that supports the narrative is accepted. Information that challenges it is ignored, minimized, or explained away. Imagine someone who believes they are always the one being mistreated. Every conflict becomes proof of that belief. Every disagreement reinforces the story they tell themselves. They rarely stop to ask whether their own actions contributed to the situation. They rarely examine their communication, attitudes, or expectations. As a result, the same problems appear again and again. Different people enter their life, different circumstances arise, but the outcomes remain remarkably similar because they never question the narrative, they never address the true source of the cycle. The tragedy of self-deception is that it often disguises itself as self-protection. People think they are protecting themselves from shame, guilt, disappointment, or rejection. In reality, they are protecting the very patterns that are causing their pain. Every avoided truth becomes another brick in the wall that separates them from growth. Every rationalization strengthens the cycle. Every excuse delays healing. Real transformation begins when a person becomes willing to face uncomfortable realities. This requires humility because humility allows us to admit that we may not see ourselves as clearly as we think. It allows us to consider the possibility that our perspective is incomplete. It gives us the courage to ask difficult questions instead of rushing toward convenient answers. The process is rarely comfortable. Honest self-reflection can expose attitudes we do not like, motives we do not want to acknowledge, and habits we have spent years defending. It can reveal fears hiding beneath our confidence, insecurities hiding beneath our pride, and wounds hiding beneath our anger. Yet these discoveries are not signs of failure. They are opportunities for freedom. A person cannot change what they refuse to acknowledge. They cannot heal what they continue to hide. They cannot break a cycle they insist does not exist. Awareness is the first step toward transformation because it removes the power of denial. Once a pattern is brought into the light, it can no longer operate in secrecy. It can be examined, challenged, and replaced with healthier behaviors. Many people spend years waiting for external circumstances to improve while overlooking the internal patterns that keep them stuck. They wait for different relationships, different opportunities, or different environments. Yet lasting change often begins long before circumstances change. It begins when a person decides to stop blaming, stop justifying, and stop pretending. It begins when they become more committed to truth than to comfort. The most powerful breakthroughs often occur when someone reaches the point where they can no longer ignore the evidence. They see the repetition, they recognize the cycle, they notice the same frustrations appearing in different forms. Instead of asking why life keeps happening to them, they begin asking what life might be trying to show them. That shift changes everything. It transforms them from passive participants into active learners. It moves them from defensiveness to growth. Self-deception may feel safe in the moment, but it comes at a tremendous cost. It keeps people trapped in patterns that drain their peace, damage their relationships, and limit their potential. Truth may feel uncomfortable at first, but truth creates possibilities that denial never can. The moment a person becomes honest about what they have been avoiding, the cycle begins to lose its grip. The walls built by excuses start to crumble. The path toward healing becomes visible. What once seemed permanent begins to change. And the very honesty that initially felt threatening becomes the key that unlocks a completely different future. One of the most confusing realities of human behavior is that people often return to the very things that hurt them. They repeat the same mistakes, enter similar relationships, react in familiar ways, and find themselves facing the same disappointments over and over again. From the outside, this can seem irrational. It may even appear as if someone is choosing pain, yet the truth is usually more complicated. Most people are not choosing pain because they enjoy suffering. They are choosing what feels familiar. The human mind is naturally drawn toward what it knows, even when what it knows is unhealthy. Familiarity creates a sense of predictability. It gives the illusion of safety because it removes uncertainty. The mind often prefers a known discomfort over an unknown possibility. This is why individuals can remain trapped in patterns that continually damage their emotional well-being. Even when they recognize that something is wrong, the idea of stepping into unfamiliar territory can feel more frightening than staying where they are. Many unhealthy patterns begin early in life. Experiences shape expectations, and expectations influence future decisions. When a person grows accustomed to certain environments, behaviors, or relationship dynamics, those experiences often become their definition of normal. They may not consciously choose them later in life, but they feel strangely comfortable around them because they are recognizable. The familiarity creates a powerful pull that influences choices without the person fully realizing it. Someone who has spent years around criticism may become so accustomed to being judged that encouragement feels suspicious. When they encounter people who genuinely support them, they may struggle to trust those relationships. Compliments feel unfamiliar. Kindness feels unexpected. Healthy interactions seem strange because they do not match the emotional environment the person has known for years. As a result, they may gravitate back toward relationships that reinforce their old expectations, even though those relationships cause pain. The same principle applies to many areas of life. A person who has lived with constant chaos may feel uncomfortable in peaceful environments. Someone who has spent years doubting themselves may resist opportunities that require confidence. An individual who has repeatedly experienced unhealthy relationships may unknowingly seek partners who display similar traits because those traits align with what feels familiar. The pattern continues not because it is healthy, but because it is recognizable. This tendency reveals an important truth about personal growth. Human beings do not automatically move toward what is best for them. They often move toward what is most familiar. Without awareness, people can spend years recreating circumstances that reinforce old beliefs, fears, and habits. They become trapped in cycles that seem impossible to escape because the cycle itself feels normal. One reason familiar pain is so powerful is because it requires very little adjustment. When people encounter situations they already understand, they know what to expect. They know how to react. They know the emotional rules of the environment. Even if the experience is unpleasant, it feels manageable because it follows a pattern they recognize. Unfamiliar situations, on the other hand, require adaptation. They demand trust, vulnerability, and courage. They force a person to step beyond established routines and beliefs. Growth often feels uncomfortable for this reason. Healthy changes introduce uncertainty. New behaviors feel awkward. Different choices create unfamiliar outcomes. The mind interprets this discomfort as danger, even when it is actually evidence of progress. Many people mistake the discomfort of growth for a sign that they are making the wrong decision. In reality, the discomfort may simply indicate that they are leaving behind old patterns. The challenge becomes even greater when emotional wounds are involved. Unhealed pain has a way of influencing behavior long after the original experience has passed. People develop coping mechanisms designed to protect themselves from future hurt. While these strategies may provide temporary relief, they often become obstacles later in life. Defensive habits that once seemed necessary can prevent meaningful connections, limit opportunities, and reinforce negative cycles. For example, a person who has experienced betrayal may become guarded in every relationship. Their caution feels justified because it protects them from vulnerability. Yet over time, the same walls that protect them from pain may also prevent them from experiencing trust and intimacy. The familiar pattern continues because it feels safer than taking emotional risks. Unfortunately, safety and growth are not always found in the same place. Breaking free from familiar pain requires more than recognizing its existence. It requires the willingness to challenge what feels normal. This can be difficult because people often build their identities around long-standing patterns. They become accustomed to certain roles, expectations, and beliefs. Letting go of those patterns can feel like losing a part of themselves. Yet true growth often involves releasing versions of ourselves that no longer serve our future. The process begins with awareness. A person must first recognize the recurring themes in their life. They must notice the similarities between situations, relationships, and reactions. Instead of viewing each disappointment as an isolated event, they begin looking for patterns. They ask difficult questions about why certain outcomes keep repeating. They examine not only what happened, but also how they contributed to the cycle. As awareness increases, choices become more intentional. Rather than automatically following familiar paths, a person learns to pause and evaluate their decisions. They become willing to choose what is healthy even when it feels uncomfortable. They stop using familiarity as the standard for what is right. Instead, they begin measuring choices according to truth, wisdom, and long-term growth. This shift requires courage because familiar pain often disguises itself as security. It whispers that change is too risky, that old habits are safer, and that familiar disappointments are easier to manage than uncertain possibilities. Yet every meaningful transformation requires stepping beyond those fears. It requires trusting that what is unfamiliar today may become the foundation for a healthier tomorrow. The individuals who experience lasting growth are not necessarily those who avoid fear. They are the ones who refuse to let fear dictate their choices. They understand that familiar patterns are not always healthy patterns. They recognize that comfort is not always evidence of wisdom. They become willing to endure the temporary discomfort of change in order to create a future that is no longer controlled by the mistakes, wounds, and limitations of the past. In doing so, they gradually discover that true freedom begins when familiarity loses its authority over their decisions and no longer determines the direction of their lives. One of the most common yet least recognized toxic patterns is the habit of blaming others while avoiding personal responsibility. It is a pattern that can quietly influence thoughts, relationships, decisions, and personal growth without drawing much attention to itself. At first glance, it often appears reasonable because there are many situations in life where other people genuinely contribute to our struggles. People can be unfair, careless, selfish, dishonest, or hurtful. There are times when we are wronged, misunderstood, or treated poorly. Acknowledging these realities is important. However, a problem arises when blaming others becomes our default response to every challenge, disappointment, conflict, or failure. When this happens, we begin to surrender the very power we need to change our lives. Blame is appealing because it offers immediate emotional relief. It allows a person to explain their pain without examining themselves. It creates a sense of innocence and protects the ego from uncomfortable truths. If someone else is always responsible, then there is no need for self-reflection. There is no need to evaluate personal choices, attitudes, habits, or reactions. The focus remains entirely on external circumstances rather than internal growth. While this may feel comforting in the moment, it often creates long-term stagnation. The danger of chronic blame is that it turns life into a story where everyone else controls the outcome. Success depends on others behaving correctly. Happiness depends on circumstances improving. Peace depends on people changing. Progress depends on conditions becoming favorable. In this mindset, personal power slowly disappears because responsibility has been transferred to external factors. The individual becomes trapped in a cycle of frustration, waiting for others to do what only they can do for themselves. Many people do not realize how deeply this pattern affects them because blame often disguises itself as justification. They replay conversations, conflicts, and disappointments, focusing entirely on what someone else did wrong. They analyze every mistake made against them while overlooking their own contribution to the situation. Their attention becomes fixed on proving they were right rather than understanding what can be learned. As a result, growth is replaced by defensiveness. A person who constantly blames others may begin to notice a pattern of repeated frustrations. Relationships repeatedly fail. Opportunities repeatedly disappear. Similar conflicts emerge in different environments. Yet instead of asking why these patterns keep occurring, they continue searching for new people to blame. Every failed relationship becomes evidence that others cannot be trusted. Every disagreement becomes proof that people do not understand them. Every setback becomes confirmation that circumstances are unfair. Because they never examine their own role in these situations, the cycle continues. This does not mean that every problem is equally shared or that victims are responsible for the harm done to them. There are situations where one party is clearly at fault. However, personal responsibility is not about accepting blame for everything that happens. It is about recognizing what remains within your control, regardless of what others choose to do. Even when someone else's actions create pain, you still have responsibility for your response, your mindset, your decisions, and your future direction. One of the greatest misconceptions about responsibility is the belief that it is a burden. Many people view responsibility as something negative because they associate it with guilt or shame. In reality, responsibility is one of the most empowering forces in personal growth. Responsibility means recognizing your ability to influence your life. It means understanding that while you cannot control every circumstance, you can control how you respond to those circumstances. It shifts the focus from helplessness to possibility. When a person embraces responsibility, they begin asking different questions. Instead of asking, "Why does this always happen to me?" they ask, "What can I learn from this experience?" Instead of asking, "Who is responsible for my frustration?" they ask, "How can I respond more effectively?" Instead of focusing exclusively on the mistakes of others, they examine their own choices, habits, and reactions. These questions create opportunities for growth because they direct attention toward areas where change is possible. The process is often uncomfortable because responsibility requires honesty. It requires a willingness to acknowledge weaknesses, mistakes, and blind spots. Most people naturally resist this because self-examination can challenge deeply held beliefs about who they are. It can reveal patterns they have spent years defending. It can expose attitudes that feel familiar but are ultimately harmful. Yet this discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is often evidence that meaningful growth is taking place. Personal responsibility also demands humility. Humility allows a person to admit that they do not have all the answers. It opens the door to learning, correction, and improvement. Without humility, people become trapped in a cycle of self-justification. They spend more energy protecting their image than improving their character. They become experts at explaining their behavior rather than changing it. The individuals who experience the greatest transformation are often those who develop the courage to examine themselves honestly. They stop viewing feedback as an attack and start seeing it as an opportunity. They become curious about their patterns instead of defensive about them. They recognize that growth is not about proving perfection, but about pursuing improvement. This mindset creates a foundation for lasting change because it keeps the focus on what can actually be controlled. As responsibility increases, something remarkable begins to happen. The person becomes less dependent on external validation, circumstances, and approval. They stop waiting for life to become easier before taking action. They stop expecting others to solve problems that belong to them. They become proactive rather than reactive. Their energy shifts away from blame and toward growth. This shift creates greater confidence because confidence is built through action, not excuses. Over time, relationships also improve because responsibility changes the way people interact with others. Conversations become less defensive. Conflicts become opportunities for understanding rather than battles for victory. Accountability replaces accusation. Learning replaces resentment. The person becomes more focused on solutions than on assigning fault. This creates healthier communication and stronger connections because growth-oriented people contribute positively to the environments around them. The truth is that blame may provide temporary comfort, but it rarely produces lasting change. It keeps attention fixed on problems without offering a path forward. Responsibility, on the other hand, creates movement. It encourages learning, adaptation, and progress. It reminds us that while we cannot control everything that happens, we are never completely powerless. The moment we stop focusing solely on what others have done and begin examining what we can do differently, we reclaim authority over our lives. That shift transforms challenges into lessons, setbacks into opportunities, and obstacles into stepping stones that lead toward greater maturity, wisdom, and personal freedom. One of the most powerful forces that keeps toxic patterns alive is fear. While many people recognize the pain caused by unhealthy habits, destructive relationships, negative thinking, or harmful behaviors, they often overlook the hidden force that prevents change from happening. That force is not always laziness, lack of knowledge, or lack of opportunity. More often, it is fear. Fear quietly influences decisions, shapes reactions, and convinces people to remain in situations that no longer serve them. It creates invisible barriers that keep individuals trapped in cycles they desperately want to escape. Fear has a unique ability to disguise itself. It rarely announces its presence directly. Instead, it appears in forms that seem reasonable and even responsible. It can look like caution, practicality, patience, or wisdom. It can sound like, maybe this isn't the right time, or I need to think about it a little longer. Sometimes it says, things might get worse if I try to change, or at least I know what to expect here. While careful decision-making is important, fear often uses these thoughts to keep people from taking necessary steps forward. What appears to be caution may actually be resistance to change. The human mind naturally seeks security and predictability. Even when a situation is unhealthy, familiar discomfort can feel safer than unfamiliar possibilities. People often assume that if something is painful, they will automatically want to leave it behind. Yet experience shows that many remain connected to situations that hurt them because the pain is known. They understand its patterns, they know what to expect, they have learned how to survive within it. The uncertainty of change feels more threatening than the certainty of discomfort. This explains why someone may remain in an unhealthy relationship long after recognizing its negative effects. It explains why people stay in environments that drain their confidence, tolerate behaviors that diminish their self-worth, or continue habits that prevent personal growth. The issue is not always a lack of awareness. In many cases, they know exactly what needs to change. The challenge is that awareness alone does not eliminate fear. Knowing what to do and having the courage to do it are often two very different things. Fear thrives on uncertainty. It constantly focuses attention on what could go wrong. It magnifies risks while minimizing possibilities. It creates vivid pictures of failure, rejection, embarrassment, disappointment, and loss. As a result, people begin making decisions based on avoiding discomfort rather than pursuing growth. They become more committed to protecting themselves from potential pain than to creating a healthier future. Over time, this mindset can become deeply ingrained. One of the most damaging effects of fear is that it encourages people to settle. Instead of pursuing what is healthy, they settle for what feels safe. Instead of confronting problems, they learn to tolerate them. Instead of growing beyond limitations, they adapt to them. The standards they once held begin to decline. Dreams become smaller, expectations become lower, possibilities become narrower. Not because they lack ability, but because fear gradually convinces them that change is too risky. Fear also affects the way people view themselves. When someone repeatedly avoids challenges, they may begin to doubt their own capabilities. Every avoided opportunity reinforces the belief that they are incapable, unprepared, or inadequate. Confidence decreases because confidence is often built through action. The less a person acts, the less evidence they have that they can overcome obstacles. This creates a cycle where fear leads to avoidance. Avoidance leads to doubt, and doubt strengthens fear even further. Many toxic patterns survive because fear makes them appear necessary. A person may hold on to resentment because they fear vulnerability. They may avoid difficult conversations because they fear conflict. They may refuse to trust because they fear betrayal. They may resist new opportunities because they fear failure. In each case, the pattern feels protective. It appears to offer security. Yet what initially seems like protection often becomes a prison. The very habits designed to prevent pain begin creating new forms of suffering. Another reason fear is so influential is because it often focuses attention on immediate discomfort rather than long-term consequences. The short-term relief gained from avoiding a difficult decision can feel rewarding. Choosing not to confront a problem eliminates temporary anxiety. Avoiding a challenge prevents immediate stress. Staying within familiar boundaries reduces uncertainty. However, while avoidance may provide temporary comfort, it frequently creates greater problems over time. The issues remain unresolved, opportunities pass by, growth is delayed, the cost of inaction continues to increase. Personal growth requires recognizing that fear itself is not the enemy. Fear is a natural human emotion. Everyone experiences it. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. The people who achieve meaningful transformation are not those who never feel afraid. They are those who refuse to let fear become the final authority over their decisions. They acknowledge their concerns while continuing to take steps toward growth. This process often begins with small acts of courage. Major life changes are rarely accomplished in a single dramatic moment. More often, they occur through consistent choices made over time. A person decides to have the difficult conversation they have been avoiding. They choose to establish healthier boundaries. They take responsibility for a mistake. They pursue an opportunity despite uncertainty. They challenge a negative belief they have carried for years. Each small action weakens the grip of fear and strengthens confidence. As confidence grows, a person begins to see fear differently. They realize that many of the scenarios they imagined never occurred. They discover strengths they did not know they possessed. They learn that discomfort does not always signal danger. In many cases, discomfort is simply evidence that growth is happening. The unfamiliar begins to feel less threatening because experience proves that change is survivable. Over time, the individual develops a new relationship with uncertainty. Instead of viewing it as something to avoid, they begin seeing it as a necessary part of progress. They understand that every meaningful achievement requires stepping into territory that feels unfamiliar. They recognize that security does not come from avoiding challenges, but from developing the ability to face them. This realization transforms the way they approach life because it shifts their focus from preserving comfort to pursuing growth. The greatest tragedy of fear is not the discomfort it creates in the present, but the possibilities it prevents in the future. Fear convinces people to remain where they are, even when they were created for more. It persuades them to protect limitations rather than challenge them. It encourages them to cling to familiar pain rather than embrace uncertain freedom. Yet every step taken beyond fear reveals a truth that fear tries desperately to conceal. Growth, healing, confidence, and transformation are often waiting just beyond the boundaries of what feels comfortable, and the willingness to move forward despite uncertainty becomes the very pathway through which a healthier and more fulfilling life is built.